Constructing your life is about much more than just building a bank account. Each week, join real estate entrepreneur and mindset coach Austin Linney as he interviews guests who are constructing their dream lives and impacting the world around them on a daily basis. If you're an entrepreneur or wanting to start a business, or you just want to hear motivating stories of how others have overcome the odds, you are in the right place. And now for your host, Austin Linney.
Welcome to the Brain Dump. We are going to dive into a topic today that makes me very uncomfortable, but I know that I'm in good company with the one, the only Austin Linney. He's going to hold my hand. He's going to make it a safe place for me to talk about vulnerability and how this impacts success. So before we get to that, Austin, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good. They call me Mr. Vulnerability. So this is perfect. So,
They do.
Yeah. There's no guy that shares his story more than I do. So this is a perfect topic for me.
And that's exactly it. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this topic in particular today is because last week I was at an event. It was a kind of a leadership, influence, persuasive speaking event. And it was a 3-day thing where you go up there and you just bare your soul trying to become a more effective communicator. And it was very interesting experience. It was very difficult because, I'm actually a pretty good communicator, but my stories fell completely flat with the audience. And as we were diving in and digging into it, somebody said something to the effect of, "You're being selectively vulnerable." And I thought that was really interesting. And I was like, because at the end of it, they're like, selective vulnerability is not actual vulnerability. And I was like, wow, that's okay. I hadn't really thought about that. I hadn't really thought about what it means to be genuinely vulnerable versus just showing the parts of myself that I want to. And I think as people who are striving to be successful in business and life in general, like we can wear our successes as like a shield of armor and we kind of hide the gushy bits underneath. So I kind of want to dive into that today.
Well, you know what's interesting? I just got this book today. Funny, the universe is hilarious. It says, start with your story. This gentleman has interviewed over 300 high-class entrepreneurs, and it teaches people how to tell their story. I've actually been studying how to tell your story and pitching people. Like this is what I'm reading Pitch Anything right now. And
was that Oren Klaff?
Yes. And selective vulnerability is so amazing because isn't selective vulnerability basically Instagram?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like what I was doing, what I found really interesting once people pointed this out, I was like, oh, wow. Yeah, I am doing that thing. What I was doing was I was sharing failures, and I put that in air quotes, that were really just disguised successes. And when somebody calls you out on that, eventually they go, that's not a real failure. You were just, that was just a jumping off point to get to the success that you wanted to talk about. And I was like, oh yeah, you're right. And so then I had to do some really deep soul searching to figure out like, well, where am I vulnerable? Because I found it's those areas that I don't look at, right? Like it's hiding really deep. And so I didn't even know where to start looking. It was a really difficult thing.
Dude, you're making me so uncomfortable with this conversation right now. I tell you what, in full disclosure, this is what it's about right now. Yeah.
So let's dive into that. Why is that making you uncomfortable? What feelings are you feeling? Because
you said something. You said something there that hit me. You're telling your failures to be the launching point off for your successes. And I told my story to a group of recovery people last night in our mastermind, and I realized that I set up the entire story in my failures to show how I've overcome it, instead of just being honest in the pure failure of.
Yeah, we're guilty. It's so I went up there and I thought I nailed it. And then when they started giving feedback, I was like, oh my God, you're right. Like that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm sharing the failures as a credibility booster so that when I get to the success, you go, oh, he's overcome this thing. And I'm not really just sharing the failure for the sake of connecting.
So then tell me, share. I'm going to learn something today. I'm very excited. So how do you share your vulnerability without setting yourself up to tell the good parts?
I don't know, honestly. Like, I still really struggle with this. Like, if you were to say, Anthony, what's the biggest thing that you're struggling with right now? I would say it's this authentic vulnerability piece. And what I had to do in that event was I had to go to a place where I just shared 3 stories that had they didn't really tie to a success. They were just 3 like outright failures. And I've learned things from them, but they're things that when I think about them, I feel shame, I think is one of the emotions that I feel. And so those are the areas that I really quarantine off in myself. I said, we're not going to talk about, we're not even going to look at those things, because I could tie them into the narrative of success, but I'm still not comfortable enough with those stories to own them and realize like it's in those events in our lives where things just went really, really wrong. And there's maybe not like a big upside, not a big plus to it that we can really connect with people.
Well, it's funny that you say that. My mentor, my coach, and my current girlfriend can hit me with things that I get uber defensive on. Like I remember I was driving in Tahoe, just got divorced, or I was about to get divorced, and my mentor started asking me about my finances. And I like the rhino in me comes out, and he was like, obviously I'm not going to touch that thread right now because you're so there's a lot of aspects. You know what's funny that you say that? Friday last week, he just eviscerated me. Like the only way a mentor can do it, like just fucking lit me up for 45 minutes, like about a bunch of different things. And he said, listen, 2 things are going to happen. You're either going to walk away from this and you're going to fucking hate me, or you're going to understand that I just gave you the biggest gift of your entire life. He said, because David Osborne did the same thing to me 2 years ago. And I sat with that for like 3 days. I have a tendency to talk a lot about what I'm going to do instead of just go do it. And I'm almost puffing myself up on aspects of not really what I've done. And so then I had a meeting with a marketing guy. We had a nice talk on Sunday, and he said, I learned something. I want you to take it with you, and I want you to share it with you the rest of your life. You only talk about business and promote from results. You lead with results, and you don't lead with what you're going to do. You lead with what you have done. And I think a lot of times in life, to pertain to your vulnerability part, we talk about what we're going to do, or we talk about what we think we're going to do, instead of just saying, this is actually what fucking happened. And what I try to do by telling my story is I try to give people a platform to understand that their story has meaning too. And I share my stuff. But over time, I think that sometimes I gloss over or maybe polish off a little bit to make it sound a little better, maybe than it should be sometimes.
There's two things here I want to unpack. One is this idea of telling people what you're going to do rather than just going out there and doing it. And you see this all the time in social media land. I'm guilty of this. And, a couple episodes back, you and I, we had a conversation where you had just incurred the wrath of what happens when you share with people what you're going to do and then it doesn't happen, and how it kills you, right? It kills you. But what happens from a neurological level, and I think this is important to understand when it comes to talking about our goals, is you get a dopamine release when you tell somebody, I'm going to be a billionaire, or I'm going to build this big company, or I'm going to be a gold medalist in the Olympics. You have already given yourself that little bit of dopamine, because what has happened is now this person has associated you with that goal, even if you're never going to make progress towards it. On a very subconscious level, they go, oh, Austin wants to be a gold medalist in the javelin, therefore he's elevated in my mind. And this happens so subconsciously that we don't even realize it. But for you sharing that goal, you get that dopamine because you know that person's now associating. And even if you never make another step of progress towards your goal, you get that dopamine. And this is why people go on social media to like, I'm going to lose 30 pounds. I'm going to do this and this and this and this. And you're like, okay, you've been saying this forever. Like, and there comes a point where you just start rolling your eyes because you know that person's not going to do it, but they're still getting the dopamine because they think they're going to do it. And that's not helpful, because if you've already given yourself the reward before you ever started, then where is your incentive to keep going? Right? Like there isn't really. So that's number one, is be really careful about how you talk about your goals in the public or with people, and make sure that if you're sharing it, it's because you are looking for accountability and saying, hey, I want to do this thing. Austin, I need you to hold me accountable to it.
Yep.
And that can be, that can be super powerful because
Yep.
that's about consistency. That's wanting to say like, I have this vision of myself. I want to build this thing. And I'm telling you so that you have that vision of me and I'm going to feel that pressure. And that's really powerful. The other thing that you mentioned there that I want to touch on is that we only lead with our results. But one of the things that we do, and one of the things I do that last week really taught me was that I only lead with the positive results or the failures that led to a positive result. Mm-hmm. And I don't even address all the times that we were wrong and that we failed and just outright failed. Like that business started it, went absolutely nowhere. It was a complete dud, lost money, broke up some relationships. It was terrible, absolute failure. I learned some things, but really like that was just a complete disaster, right? Like we don't lead with that story generally.
You know, my girlfriend asked me something last night. Here's what's fucking weird. The universe is weird. I had like a ton of podcasts yesterday. I don't really speak to my dad that much. And, I call my mom probably once a month, maybe once or two. Like we don't talk either. Both parents called me yesterday on the same fucking day. And my girlfriend asked me, and she's like, you never talk about your childhood. And as a coach, I'm always looking to the future. I'm always like, that old life, that alcoholic life, that drug addict life, that homeless life, like I've left it behind me. What I realize is there's some things back there. I've done a lot of work. I think there's a young part of me that hides aspects of the truth in there because he's trying to protect me against my mind and my soul because he thinks he can't handle it. So I think I've closed off a lot of my childhood. And I think if I were to spend some time reopening some things, I think I would have some closure to some of those aspects of my life now that I'm saying it out loud.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the core of this vulnerability message that I want to get across, because this is not going to be an episode where I share any tips or tricks or track tactics for like getting to the bottom of this, because I'm on this journey as well. But one of the things is that place that you're most afraid to look, or you don't even realize you're not looking there. Like that's your subconscious mind has like shielded you off and protected you from that for a reason. And that's probably where you need to spend your time digging. That's probably the X that marks the spot. One of the what's really fascinating. So I went to this event, and on the second day of it, I called my girlfriend. We had a long chat that evening, and I was sharing like some of the things that I'd learned and some of the difficulties I had. And she goes, this was completely unprompted. Before we even started talking about the vulnerability side of the conversation, she goes, I listened to 2 of your podcasts today, and you tell the same stories, but you do it in a way where you're not being like truly vulnerable. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, because that was one of the topics of today's discussion was around vulnerability. And I was like, so what do you mean by that? And she goes, well, you'll share these things that obviously had a big impact, and you'll share it, and then you'll just kind of gloss over it really quickly and go straight to the success on the backside. But you don't take the time to unpack like how it made you feel, or like what the true impact of it was. You just kind of like mention like, oh yeah, by the way, this, and then you move straight on to the next thing. And so it's really hard to connect with that. So if there is a bit of tactical advice here, it would be spend the time feeling the whatever it is that you feel when you're exposing that vulnerability or that thing inside of you that feels scary to look at. Just let yourself feel it.
I've said my story on many podcasts, like my story. Had a coaching client reach out to me, and he said, now, granted, it depends on how long the podcast is. Sometimes I try to fit it all in. Mm-hmm. There's a lot there. He said, I love the way that you paint the picture, but I want you to, you know what's funny? I think we talked about this on a text message. We talked about how the big guys are sitting on stage or are writing a book from a big, broad spoke. And I think I'm so far removed from my alcohol addiction that to truly connect and to truly make the impact that I seek, I need to sit with a lot of the emotions that I probably felt 2 or 3 years ago. And if I truly want to be the coach that I long to be, like the best at my craft, understanding and not running away from it, but understanding the feeling and the emotions tied to, I just want to get sober and I can't get my life better, will make me a better coach now that I'm saying that out loud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's fascinating. One of the other guys at this event, he was up there presenting, and he was sharing a story that was like really dark and sad. Like he had his wife was pregnant, and she said, "Whatever you do, don't lose the house." And then he went and lost the house while they were pregnant, like that type of like thing where he had to like sit down and tell her, "Hey,
I've done it." She wasn't pregnant, but I've done the same thing.
Yeah, and you had to like sit down and have that conversation and like say, "Hey, we're losing the house." And like when he was sharing the story, like it's a story where you think about it, you're like, wow, that must have been absolutely horrible. But he was saying it with a smile on his face. And he was saying like, because without these failures, I wouldn't be the guy that I am today. And it rings so hollow because you're like, no, that sounds horrible. And he's like, if I had to go back and do it all again, I'd gladly do it again. And we're like, you would gladly go back and have to sit down with your pregnant wife and tell her that? Like, it just doesn't ring true. Mm-hmm. And so I'm all about this idea that our failures lead us to our eventual successes. I'm so on that camp, but we can't just gloss over, because with time and distance, we look at our failures and it doesn't feel as bad as it did at the time. But certainly at the time, it felt a very specific, horrible way. And if you can connect with that, that's, I think, where the authenticity like really, really resides for people.
100%. I don't want to say any more. I think we crushed that conversation. Yeah.
All right. So that's going to do it for us, guys. Before you take off, make sure that you go and leave a review. Tell Austin that you love him, and we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to Construct Your Life with Austin Linney. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, subscribe, and pay it forward by sharing with a friend. Most importantly, take this opportunity to start constructing your life by taking immediate action on what you learned. For show notes, resources, and more information on one-on-one coaching with Austin, visit constructyourlifepodcast.com.